Hi, everybody. We are finally back. Kelly, do you know how long it's been since we've had
I,
one of these?
I don't, but I know the reason we decided to come back.
Oh, well, the one and only Regie Routman, who
Oh,
is
God.
with us. Are you kidding? Oh, my goodness. Yeah, we,
Yeah, I look back, Regie, at my bookshelf, started pulling off some of the oldies but goodies.
yeah.
Um, this one that you wrote for Stenhouse recently, I think, encapsulizes your like long and illustrious career. And I'm really excited. We're going to talk a little bit today about your new book, The Heart-Centered Teacher. But and I know that off camera, both Penny and I individually had expressed incidents in our career where you
So
out of
sweet.
nowhere showed up with an act of kindness. So
Yeah.
we're
I don't remember
fanboying
any of
and
that. Yeah.
fangirling today having you on.
No, that's so sweet. I can't tell you. I'm just so honored because you are two people that I have just admired and learned from for so long. And so to be able to have a conversation like this is really a privilege. So thank you for inviting me.
Oh, my goodness. Regie, I you were in the front row when I was presenting with Don Graves, one of the very first times I'd ever presented at NCTE. And I was literally shaking when I saw you because everything that I thought about teaching, especially starting as an elementary teacher, I was standing on your shoulders. And so much of what you've done all through your career is live by these same principles,
Yeah.
right? And I think what's powerful about this book that I really hope so many teachers will read is in the subtitle, not only The Heart-Centered Teacher, but Restoring Hope, Joy, and Possibility in Uncertain Times. Our teachers feel it. Our kids certainly feel it. And you're offering really clear and effective advice in this book, as you always have. So thank you so much for just spending time talking to us.
That's very kind, all of that.
What's really interesting, Regie, amongst many things, is this is unlike any PD book I have ever read, and I mean that
Yay!
I mean that as a I mean that as a compliment,
I knew you did.
right? So this idea, it's not just a book of strategies. It's a book that I think really reflects how many years? 45? How many years you've been
Oh,
in the
50,
game?
you're being over 50 years.
50 years in the game. And that wisdom, you know, there's things that I really love. Like you said something like, there's a difference between talking to students and talking at students, and that you see them.
Yeah.
That seeing students is really, really important. And as part of that in the book, you talk about love and you expand the definition of love a little bit. Could you share a little of that with us?
Yeah. I'm so glad you picked up on that. And I think I start the book by I know I start the book by talking about my work with a 54-year-old custodian who contacted me at the beginning of the pandemic after he had lost his job and asked me if I could teach him to, work with him on his reading and writing and make his life more interesting. And so the story I tell in the book, as you know, is that he started saying, he would say, "Thank you, peace," and that would be the end of the session. And then all of a sudden he started saying, "Peace, thank you, I love you." I didn't know what to say back. I remembered Don Holdaway's work, who was my most important and influential mentor, saying how important it was to bond with the students. So I'd been carrying that for many decades. And then it really got me thinking about, well, what does it mean to love a student? Now, you all have like hundreds of students. So what does that mean? And I think what I came to, and having been married for a very long time, um, I wrote in the book over 50 years, but actually it's closer to 60 years to a really good guy. And I think that I came to see from my relationships with people and with students in particular, that seeing them is a way of loving them. And by seeing them, they feel you're welcome here, you're safe here. I honor your culture and your background and your language. I will listen to you. And so all of that, and really is a whole way of looking, a different way, I think, of looking at love, both in our classrooms, because obviously you can't like love hundreds and hundreds of students, but if we look at it, I think you can see them, and so many of those opportunities can come through writing. I mean, both of you are masters of the quick write and all kinds of writing. So that was a very, very big deal. And it was only because I was able to see him when I thought about that, that I could really teach him, you know, and seeing him meant I had to find out what he was all about and not worry about the curriculum. I didn't know how I was going to teach him. You know, I write about the fact we only had 2 phones because he didn't know how to, he didn't know how to text. He didn't own a computer. We both had an iPhone, but a big hill behind my house. So I had to use a landline. And so what was I going to do? But I learned to see him through our conversations and found out what he was interested in. And we went from there.
Mm.
And so that was a big lesson for me. And then it became, I don't want to say easy, but he felt safe with me.
Mhm.
And so he shared some difficult things emotionally. And also, as the trust grew, he made it very clear that he was going to be choosing all the books, you know. I talk about that was quite interesting, that story. But I think it's a very big deal because I think you can be married for a long time and love your spouse. But do you see that person? Do you actually, you know, and accept that person with all of their, you know, faults and deficits and what, you know, all the inadequacies we all have? So I think it's just another way of, I think you do have to love your students is what I came to, but kind of expanding on that definition a little bit. Yeah.
I could definitely feel that in the book because, and I was thinking about adult learners because you were talking about someone reaching out. And I don't know if you know this, but when Dawn and Betty Graves, they lived just 10 minutes from me when we first moved here. And Betty was teaching at the Berlin prison, which is about an hour north of their house. Yeah, she was teaching adults who had never learned to read. And she was, you know, she would collect picture books and talk about that. And I think it's such a beautiful way to give back to the community when you want to leave your classroom. There are English teachers who started a program called Poetic Justice in the prisons in Oklahoma. And I've been able to visit several times and poetry and write poetry with them, but they're now expanded all over southern states and California and Tijuana and all kinds of places. And I think there's something really powerful about teaching adults. It reminds us of what matters with kids. And I think that's that beautiful connection you just made.
Well, absolutely, because you're not, at least I wasn't thinking about what skills was I going to teach him. That never went through my head ever. I suspect he was labeled dyslexic. I never asked him. I believe he was in special ed, but I don't know that for sure. And I never asked him. It didn't matter because we had kind of an invisible contract that I was going to teach him and he was going to show up, you know, to do this work. And that's actually what happened.
You know, it's interesting because one of the things you say in the book that I think touches on this is that this idea of teaching all students as if they are honor students.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, that comes from, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing in your work my most significant work was the residency work where I would go into schools. They were all underperforming schools, mostly Black and brown kids, second language learners, and the expectations in every single case, no exceptions, were so low. And that is heartbreaking. And when we would have people visit after I'd been, you know, working with the school and the teachers for just a couple of years, people would think it was a gifted class. Now, why was that? It was just looking at the kids differently. I think that has not changed, unfortunately, in our educational system. And I think that was why Ted, as I call him in the book, made so little progress, is because he looks a little bit different. And he had nothing but phonics and skills, you know, so that's a whole other thing. And I was able to weave that in when it made sense to him, but not starting there. So I think, and this must be true for you working with your kids, you have the required curriculum, but you've got to find a way to engage them in that, because if they're not engaged, it's a big so what? They're just not going to remember it. They're not going to value it, you know?
They're
Yeah,
teenagers.
we
They're
talk
not
a
gonna
lot
do
about,
it.
yeah, we talk a lot about you're not teaching stuff, you're teaching kids, right? And so, you know, there's that classic study that said if you really were to teach every standard to the degree in which every kid would understand it, if the kids were at grade level, you'd have to change K-12 to K-22. So I think this idea, that's a Marzano study. I think the idea of chasing the standards has gotten in the way of your word again, seeing who's in the classroom. And
Right.
the word that Penny uses a lot, and I use a lot, is being responsive to the kids who
Yeah,
are there.
absolutely. And then I talk about, teaching readers, teaching writers, not teaching reading and teaching writing. And that's a very big difference, because, and I wrote about that in my last couple of books, that you're teaching human beings. They're all unique, they're different. And the subject matter is almost secondary in a way, because if they don't feel known and respected and their culture valued, they're not going to take us very seriously. They tune out, you know.
They do. And Regie, I think, something that we talk a lot about at the secondary level is that teachers set the pace on a book.
Mm-hmm.
And so many students are put off by that. I was sitting
Absolutely.
next to a kid yesterday who told me it took him 4 hours to read the 120 pages for his book club meeting yesterday. And he loves the book, but he said, I have always been a slow reader. And he said it like so embarrassed. And I said, there is like no badge for being a fast reader. And in fact,
Right.
slow readers often, just learn so much and think so deeply. And as Jackie Woodson said, I would read sentences over and over again just to think about how they worked. And we don't honor that enough. I asked my students, what made you more interested and less interested in reading, and give them 2 Post-its at the start of the year. And this year, this flood of kids said they were always going too fast.
Interesting.
We
Yeah.
just, the pace is never going to be right for every kid. So why do we not allow for more flexibility? And I know what teachers will answer, but I think it's, again, a kid who doesn't feel seen never feels like their,
Mm-hmm.
their learning style or their difficulties are respected enough. It feels like they're always behind.
Yeah. And they feel like they're always behind. Now, just to your point, the very first book that Ted read in his adult life was The Old Man and the Sea. And that took us 3 months. But because he loved the story and he connected to it, and it was a beautiful, I don't want to say it's simple language, but beautiful, carefully chosen words. His attention and his interest never wavered, because
Exactly.
he loved the book, and he was able to read it, even though it took 3 months. Didn't matter. Didn't matter. So that's a great point.
On the writing side,
Yeah.
of kids being seen, I was really heartened to see in your new book a pretty big chunk on the value and importance of story.
Oh, absolutely. That has been such a huge, and I think that's where it's all connected to low expectations. I think everything in our life, professionally and personally, is connected to story. Who's telling the story? Is it a reliable narrator? Whose voices are being silenced? And it's all, of course, connected to book banning, right? And all of the, difficult stuff that's going on. But the 1619 Project, that book really impacted me, even though I'm not a historian. And the whole idea that maybe we were asking the wrong question and asking kids to, focus on the wrong questions. You know, really looking at the rich culture of enslaved people and indigenous people, and looking at history from multiple points of view, was really opened my eyes wide. I don't think I was until I read that book, and Ta-Nehisi Coates and Clint Smith, and one of my favorites, with the the cover has the swimming pool. It'll come to me. The Sum of Us.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
That was one of my favorites. You know, the whole notion that if we have to downgrade one group if another group is, you know, rising, and of course that's what's happening politically and all that, which
Yeah.
doesn't make sense.
Well,
Um,
your one of your points in your book was that we should never ask kids to do what we won't do ourselves. And you had this list that I thought was so powerful of things that just like principles. And I was thinking about, you reveal so much in this book about your own life and your own stories and how
Yeah.
powerful that is. You're reaching out and making this connection.
I'm at a point in my life where the personal and the professional cannot be separated. I don't. And when I would work into school, go into schools, I would bring my whole self into the classroom. It wasn't like I left, okay, that part of you, your personal stories, the things you love to do, your friends, your cooking, gardening, and all that, that stays back. And you're only going to be a teacher, you know, of reading and writing and whatever else we're teaching. And so I always brought my stories into the classroom with me because I believed in that wholeness, because education is so segmented, you know, it's that whole part whole. And there's this people think, well, if we just, you know, teach enough parts, everything's going to just kind of glom together and kids are going to get it. And of course they don't. We make learning harder for them. So I went out on a limb with this book because I'm a very private person. And I have never in a tweet ever mentioned that I'm married, that I have kids. I've never done that. But at this point in my life, it felt really important. And I share the death of our son, Peter, several years ago from a very rare cancer, which was a terrible thing to go through. On the other hand, all of us, if we live long enough, face hardships and losses. And so I was at a point where I wanted to give back to the profession and not just write another book about how we teach readers and writers and history and everything else, but how can we live a really good life in spite of all of the bad things that are happening in the world? I don't know that I've been alive at a time where we've been so close to heading toward autocracy, right? And so how do we handle that? How do we keep our hope alive and still have a very good life? Now, it's very interesting. I've sent my book out to a number of people. It's only been out like less than 2 weeks, but when I get a response from people, nobody, with one exception so far, people don't mention that we lost our son Peter, and we also had a daughter who died when she was 25. So they don't mention it because we don't talk about that kind of loss in our society. But the one person who did mention it, that's so wonderful, because when you lose someone you love, you don't want that person to disappear. You still want to talk about him. Now, the hardest part was actually getting my husband. I thought, you know, he's not that interested in education. He's proud of my books and everything because he loves me. But he was locked in a closet by his first grade teacher because I guess he was a rambunctious, darling little boy. So he was never one that fell in love with, you know, being a student. So, you know, he's been proud of my books and everything. But this one, I thought, oh my goodness, I can't write about this personal stuff unless he approves. I don't know if he will. He's even more private than I am. But he did. And he said, you've honored our children. And it was, and you want to do that. You want to honor students. You want to honor people that aren't there anymore. And so I wrote the book because when I said this in the book, I was at a crossroads in that I wanted to, I don't want to say end my career, but at this point in my career, do something that tied everything together, write a really significant book that was not just about teaching, but was about living and living a full life in spite of, and also looking at self-care, because I was not in a good place. I was very anxious. I'm not typically an anxious person. I really didn't know what do I do now, you know? There was no kind of map there, and there isn't. And so I began thinking about self-care as other care. What can I do that will also help others? And so this is a genre-breaking book with this beautiful cover by Toby Gordon, who you know.
Yes,
Pull that up again because Toby's going to watch at some point. And I had to work hard to get that cover because, most of the covers are very academic looking. And I wanted a cover that would set the tone for the book. And Toby's a former editor and she's a great artist. And so that all worked out really
I
well.
mean, the issue, I was struck when you wrote about Liz and Peter. I was struck by the act of bravery of you doing that. And I think it raises a question for all teachers, what's your level of vulnerability in the classroom? And Penny and I say this a lot, there are things I've done I would never share in a classroom.
Yeah.
But, I've written about a family member who had a rough life. Penny has written about her family in front of kids because that story is what connects kids to the classroom. And, there's sort of this bias out there that narrative or story isn't as, the higher you go K-12 isn't as academic or it isn't as valuable. And Penny and I have been pushing back against that idea pretty hard in our two books together.
Well, I think when kids see us as vulnerable, like when you tell your stories, the hard stories and also the just really wonderful, funny stories, that allows your students to see us as people with flaws, with hard lives. It was certainly one of the things that allowed Ted to connect with me because he knew well about our loss. And so when he would say, I'm having a hard day, I don't know if I can show up today, I said, you know what? I'm having a hard day too, but we made a commitment and we're going to work together. And I think we have to be careful about what we share with our students, but I think there's always things that you can share where you can make that connection, right?
Absolutely. Even just writing, yesterday in class, we were imitating a strategy of making a list of things that you want to thank someone for based on a passage. And on the whiteboard, I chose my dog because when my dog almost died a few months ago, I was holding him and saying, stay with us, stay with us. I then made a list of all of the things I love about this dog. And I've actually never written this. And I can't tell you how many students were like, oh, Miss Kittle, I have this dog, or I lost this dog, or I left this dog behind when I moved to college. And they're like, you're creating part of that relationship in that little minute, 4-minute quick write. They're saying, we can talk about this.
You're showing your humanity. And that is a gift, I think.
As an invitation, right? And then they share
As
theirs.
an invitation, yes.
And those bonds that are formed, when I put kids in writing groups and say, all I want from you today is to find a passage in your notebook. We've done so many that you're willing to talk to other people about. You don't have to read it, but even, and just watching their faces as they listen to the stories each other carries, the missed opportunity of not having kids write story and instead have them write about books all of the time is incalculable. It will change everything about your room.
Absolutely. It's all about story, like you said, Kelly.
Yeah, the other thing that was interesting too is, if you're a classroom teacher today, you have troubled kids. That anxiety is through, it's woven into the fabric now.
Right.
What I picked up in reading about your personal stories was that the writing itself helped.
Absolutely.
The writing itself.
Absolutely.
And this is just another reason why we should be giving kids opportunities.
Yes, absolutely. And the story in the book that resonates a lot for me is the one of Crystal, who was a high school student. And it was the writing. Her life was as difficult and horrific as any. I couldn't even put the details in terms of the abuse that she suffered. But the writing set her free. And it was in the poetry. And she just had a whole personality change. And it's the whole notion of story. I think what I love about story is restorying. That kids need to know that their story is not fixed. I thought about you both because I'm reading this book. It's a brand new book. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called Up Home, One Girl's Journey by Ruth Simmons. And coincidentally, she was on the PBS NewsHour, which I watch. And it's the story. It's about how her story changed. She was born about the same time I was. Her parents were, cotton pickers. She grew up in a shack with no running water. She went on to she was the youngest of 12 children.
Ooh.
And she went on to become the president of Smith, the president of Brown University. And it's I wanted to share it with you in particular, because I could see every high school student reading this. You just connect to it, every college student reading, about halfway through. But the message she's giving is that your story is not determined by your birth, or shouldn't be, and how this opportunity came about, that she was able to get an education when nobody else in her family was. And it's very well written. So
it's on my list now. In fact, next to it, it says Regie, because I know if you recommended it, I got to read it. And I have so many things on my list.
Well, I think in order to be a writer, you have to be a reader. I mean, we're all big. In fact, I think, Kelly, I think when I saw one of your tweets, you had just finished reading or had bought King. Was that you?
Yes.
And see, I want you to see that it's on my bookshelf.
I see the big yellow book back there.
I haven't started it, but after you said that, because you are, and Penny, and have other people, and Toby Gordon, that are reliable book pickers, and I don't know that if you love that book, I'm gonna find that book really important as well.
One of the downfalls of being friends with Penny is I'm a lot poorer now.
Yeah.
Because and I have desks that look like this over here, because I can't keep up with her.
Hardly. We're in a book club together though, and one thing I love about the book club is we have Chris Crutcher, who is, as you know, just a phenomenal writer.
Yes.
I swear to you, every time he picks the book, we both go, it's going to be great. And then you're just like, what? Like, he had us read Demon Copperhead, which I bet you've read.
I haven't read that yet.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I just think that when you love language and you love reading, there's an automatic, I want to take my turn and tell my story.
Yeah.
And I think that automatic, and kids are so genre kind of centered when they come to me, because they're a little bit older and they've had a lot of experience. And one of mine, he's a student from the Czech Republic. He's playing hockey at our university. And he said, I am so into fantasy. Give me a fantasy book I can write forever. And our first piece on story, I said, Will, there's no difference in skill between fiction and nonfiction. So why don't you write your own? And he spent hours crafting this very complex narrative, and is so excited about just what he's created. And isn't that more important than another template essay that looks like all the others he's already written? And we miss something when we don't get to see that joy in our students.
Yeah. And they're lucky that they have what's happening today. And you asked me to comment on that. I know we're probably close to the end of time, but the curriculum is so regimented with the book banning and with the pressure that librarians are under, that we're not hearing all the stories. We're not writing the stories that children deserve to read and write. And that's a big problem. And it seems to be a bit worse today than it was. In my estimation, I write about the fact that this whole thing on the science of reading, I went through that in the 60s. I was alive then. And in the 60s, and then 30 years later in the 90s, and now again 30 years later. The same, should I say, the same, I was going to say crap, but
it's okay.
Where people get all exercised about we're not teaching phonics. And the truth was, when I graduated college in the 1960s, that's the only thing I knew. I didn't know anything about teaching reading comprehension. I was, what some people would call a phonicator. I knew all the rules. And it didn't help me that much with kids like Ted. And then the same thing happening over and over again, in spite of the fact that we know that that's just it's a very important piece, but it's not, I don't even want to say it's the major piece, because you want kids to fall in love with books and you want them to be passionate about being readers and writers.
I don't sit down and go, I want to read that book you recommended so I can practice phonics.
No,
right? That's, I mean,
point.
come on. There's more to it than knowing the letters. And of
And
course it matters.
And the choice is such a big part, no matter what curriculum you're doing. And you both of you are so masterful at that kids have choice in what they read.
Mm.
And that's what turned Ted into a reader. I mean, it was shocking when he said to me, I want to read the Obama memoir. And I'm thinking to myself, it's 700 pages and you're not a reader. I'm thinking that to myself. And I'm saying, sure, okay, how are we going to do this? And then he figured out on his own, well, I could do this with your help, but and an audiobook, but I think I'll pass and just listen to this one. But the choice is so critical, right?
Oh. Mhm.
Well, I want to just say in these troubled times, when I look at, this, as I said, is a different kind of PD book. And a lot of this book is really not just about helping kids, it's about helping yourself stay healthy in a very troubled time. Right. And so I just think it's coming out at the right time. And before Penny says goodbye, I just want to say you've drudged up one bad memory, Regie, because when you talked about getting locked in a closet, I hadn't thought about this in a long, long time. Mrs. Hutchinson in the 3rd grade, I was a little rambunctious too. On the chalkboard, not the whiteboard, she drew a circle and I had to put my nose in it and stand there for 10 minutes. And my nose had to touch the blackboard the entire time.
Oh, how awful. Well, no wonder you suppressed that memory.
But no, that's great. I want to write about it now.
I was going to say, I wish there were smartphones because I want that picture of little Kellen Gallagher with his nose stuck in the chalk.
Well, and you can just do so much from that. Write about an embarrassing moment that you don't mind sharing with others, or it's just
it's just been amazing listening to you, Regie. I wish that you were still going to conferences and things because I always went to your sessions. And I even remember when you first started learning how to present off your iPad and I was in the audience going, look at her. Nothing stops this woman. But here's one of my favorite titles of a chapter: Co-creating a joyful, inclusive culture. That's what this book does. It pulls back from lesson by lesson and says, these are the hallmarks of joy for you and your students. And it's all here. And this is not a dense and difficult read. It's a joyful, story-based read that is chock full of advice and lessons learned. But more than anything, you just feel like you found a friend that you could talk to.
That's very heartwarming. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with both of you. And, I follow your work. I've always followed your work. And I've learned so much from you both, and that's what the profession is at its best, that we're giving back, we're learning from each other, and we're helping kids and we're seeing them. We're seeing them as capable as they are.
One more surreal moment in my teaching career, spending the morning with Regie Routman. Regie, thank you so much for giving the time, and congratulations on the book. We
thank
hope
you so
it
much.
really moves the world a little bit.
Absolutely.
I love to you both. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.